The morning air at Windsor Castle was cold and still. Guards stood at attention, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone walls. Tourists gathered behind velvet ropes, cameras ready. No one expected what was about to happen. Prince George walked beside his grandmother, Queen Camilla. His small hand held hers tightly. Behind them, his younger sister Charlotte skipped along, her blue dress swaying with each step. It was supposed to be a simple royal walk, a routine appearance. Nothing more. But George stopped suddenly. His shoes scraped against the cobblestones. Camilla's hand pulled forward slightly before she realized he wasn't moving. She turned, her smile patient but confused. "Come along, darling," she said softly. George didn't move. His young face was serious. Too serious for a boy his age? His eyes were fixed on something ahead. One of the Queen's guards stood perfectly still in front of them, as they always did. Tall, silent, a mauve. The tradition was clear. When royals passed, even a child must bow. It showed respect. It honored the crown. George knew this. He had done it before. But today, something was different. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe now so you never miss another incredible royal moment. You won't believe what happens next. Camilla's smile faded. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent reminder. Charlotte stopped skipping. She looked at her brother, then at Camilla, sensing the tension in the air. "George," Camilla whispered, leaning closer. "You must bow." Still, George stood frozen. His jaw was set. His small shoulders squared. Tourists began to notice. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Phones rose higher. Fingers pressed record. The guard didn't move. He couldn't. That was the rule. But beneath the tall bearskin hat, his eyes shifted. Just slightly. Enough to show he saw what was happening. Camilla's expression changed. The warmth drained from her face. This wasn't just a child being difficult. This was defiance.
Ow.
In public, in front of the world, she knelt down beside George, her voice lower now, urgent. "You know what you must do?" George's lips pressed together. He shook his head. Small, firm, final. Charlotte tugged on Camilla's sleeve. "Why won't he bow?" she asked, her voice innocent and confused. Camilla didn't answer. She stood up slowly, her back straight, her face now a mask of royal composure. But her hand trembled slightly as she let go of George's. The guard's gloved hand twitched. It was barely noticeable, but Camilla saw it. George saw it too, and then the unthinkable happened. The guard moved. Asterisk, it was only a step. One boot forward, breaking the rigid stance that had held him like a statue. The sound echoed in the silence. Sharp, deliberate. Wrong gasps came from the crowd. A Queen's guard never moved. Not for rain, not for heat, not for anything. There were symbols. Stone carved into men, but this one had stepped toward the young prince. Camilla's breath caught in her chest. Her fingers reached out instinctively, pulling Charlotte back. The little girl's eyes went wide. She didn't understand, but she felt the fear. George didn't flinch. He stared up at the guard, his small frame dwarfed by the towering figure. The bearskin hat cast a shadow over the man's face, but George could see his eyes now. They were dark, intense, and they were looking directly at him. "Step back," Camilla said, her voice sharp with authority. She wasn't speaking to George. She was speaking to the guard. The guard didn't respond. He took another step, closer now. Close enough that George could see the brass buttons on his uniform. Close enough to hear the leather of his gloves creak as his hand moved. Tourists screamed. Some ran, others stood frozen, phones still recording, unable to look away. Security officers in dark suits began moving through the crowd, but they were too far. Too slow. Camilla placed herself between George and the guard. Her voice was iced. "I command you to stop." The guard's hand rose. Slowly, deliberately. It moved toward his tall hat, fingers gripping the black fur. For a moment the world held its breath. Then he lifted the hat from his head. His face was young. Younger than anyone expected. His expression wasn't angry or threatening. It was something else. Something harder to read. Pain, maybe? Or guilt. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice breaking the sacred silence that guards were never supposed to break. "I cannot let this stand." Camilla's face went pale. "You will be arrested. Discharged. You know this." The guard nodded. "I know." George's small voice cut through the tension. "Why must I bow?" He asked not to Camilla, but to the guard. "Why must I bow to you?" The guard's jaw tightened. He looked down at the boy, and for a moment, something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. "You don't bow to me, Your Highness," the guard said quietly. "You bow to the uniform, to the crown, to the duty it represents." George shook his head. "But you're just a man." The words were simple, innocent, but they carried weight that no one expected. The guard's expression cracked. Just for a second. Just enough. "Yes," he whispered. "I am just a man." Charlotte clung to Camilla's dress, her small hands shaking. Camilla's mind raced. Protocol demanded she call for the guard's removal. Tradition demanded George bow. But something in this moment felt bigger than protocol. Bigger than tradition, the guard lowered himself. Slowly, he took a knee. His uniform stretched as he bent, one hand on his chest, his head bowed low. "Not to the Queen, not to duty, to George." "Forgive me, Your Highness," he said, his voice barely audible. "I forgot what it means to be seen." The crowd was silent. Cameras captured every second, and George, small and serious, stepped forward. George reached out. His small hand hovered in the air between them. The guard's eyes lifted, meeting the boy's gaze. For a moment, neither moved. The world seemed to pause. Waiting then, George's hand touched the guard's shoulder. Light, gentle, the way a child comforts someone they don't fully understand, but somehow know is hurting. "Stand up," George said softly. "Please." The guard's eyes glistened. He blinked quickly, fighting something back. Slowly, he rose to his feet. His tall frame towered over George again, but something had changed. The power had shifted. Camilla watched, her mind spinning. Security officers had reached the edge of the scene now, hands on radios, waiting for her signal. One word, and they would take the guard away. One gesture, and this would end. But she didn't give the signal. Charlotte peeked out from behind Camilla's dress. "Is he sad?" She whispered. Camilla knelt down, pulling Charlotte close. "Yes, darling. I think he is." George turned to look at his grandmother. His young face was calm, determined. "He doesn't want me to bow because of fear," George said. "He wants me to bow because I understand." Camilla's breath caught. How could a child see so clearly? How could he know what even she had struggled to grasp? The guard replaced his hat slowly. His hands shook as he adjusted it. He straightened his uniform, pulling the red fabric smooth. Then he returned to his post, shoulders back, eyes forward. But he was different now. Everyone could see it. George stepped closer to the guard's position. He looked up at the towering figure, now silent and still again. Then, with deliberate slowness, George bowed, not quickly, not out of obligation, but with intention, with meaning. It was the deepest bow anyone had ever seen him make. When he arose, there were tears on Camilla's cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. Charlotte ran to her brother, hugging him tightly. Tourists lowered their phones. Some were crying too. Others stood in stunned silence. The guard didn't move. But his chest rose and fell heavily. Once, twice. A breath he'd been holding, finally released. Camilla took George's hand again. This time he held hers just as tightly. They walked past the guard together, Charlotte between them. As they moved away, Camilla paused. She looked back at the young guard, still standing at attention. "What is your name?" she asked. The guard hesitated. Guards didn't speak. Guards didn't have names when they wore the uniform. But she had asked. The Queen Consort had asked. "Thomas, Your Majesty," he said quietly. Private Thomas Henley. Camilla nodded. Thank you, Thomas. He didn't respond. He couldn't, but his eyes said everything. As the royal family disappeared into the castle, the crowd began to disperse. Voices buzzed with shock and wonder. Videos were already uploading. Headlines were already being written. But no one truly understood what had happened, except for one person, inside the castle. Away from cameras and crowds, George sat in a quiet room. Camilla sat beside him, Charlotte playing with her dolls nearby. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Why did you refuse to bow at first? Camilla asked gently. George looked down at his hands. Because everyone was watching. They wanted me to do it because they always watch. Because I'm supposed to. He looked up at her, his eyes clear. But that's not why we bow, is it? Camilla's heart ached. She shook her head slowly. No, my darling, it's not. But outside, in the corridors of power, phones were ringing. Advisors were panicking, and decisions were being made. The palace conference room was cold. Royal advisors sat around a long table, their faces grave. Tablets glowed in front of them, displaying headlines that grew more dramatic by the minute. Social media had exploded. The video had been viewed millions of times in just hours. This is a crisis, one advisor said, his voice tight. A guard broke protocol. The prince refused to bow. The optics are disastrous. Another nodded. We need to control the narrative. Issue a statement. Discipline the guard immediately. But the head of the king's household, an older man named Sir Graham, held up his hand. Have any of you actually watched the full video? He asked quietly. The room fell silent. Sir Graham turned his tablet around. The video played. George's refusal. The guard stepping forward. The moment of tension, and then the bow. George's bow. Deliberate, meaningful, pure. When it ended, no one spoke. The people aren't angry, Sir Graham said. Look at the comments. Look at what they're saying. One advisor pulled up her phone, scrolling quickly. Her expression shifted. They're calling it beautiful, she whispered. They're saying George showed more wisdom than most adults. Another checked his tablet. There's a trending hashtag. Bow with meaning. People are sharing stories about empty traditions. About doing things without understanding why. Sir Graham leaned back in his chair. The guard will face consequences. That's unavoidable. But perhaps this isn't a crisis. Perhaps it's something else. Meanwhile, in the guard's barracks, Thomas Henley sat on his bunk. His uniform was folded neatly beside him. He'd been relieved of duty immediately after the incident. His commanding officer had been brief and cold. You'll face a hearing, the officer had said. Likely discharge. Possibly worse. Thomas had nodded. He'd expected nothing less. But he didn't regret it. For years, he'd stood in that uniform, invisible, a decoration, a symbol. People looked at him but never saw him. Children were forced to bow, never understanding why, until today. Until one small boy asked the question everyone forgot to ask. Why? A knock came at the door. Thomas stood, expecting his commanding officer. Instead, an aide in royal livery stepped inside. Private Henley, the aide said formally. Your presence is requested. Thomas's heart sank. This was it. The hearing had come early. He followed the aide through corridors he'd never walked before, deeper into the private areas of the palace. They stopped at a door carved with intricate designs. The aide opened it. Inside, please. Thomas stepped through. The room was small, but elegant. A sitting room. And there, standing by the window, was Queen Camilla. Beside her, Prince George. Thomas's training kicked in. He stood at attention, eyes forward. At ease, Thomas, Camilla said gently. He relaxed slightly but didn't speak. Protocol was already shattered. He wouldn't make it worse. George stepped forward. He looked up at Thomas with those serious eyes. Are you in trouble? He asked. Thomas's throat tightened. Yes, Your Highness. George frowned. Because of me? No, Thomas said quickly. Because I broke the rules. Right. But the rules were wrong, George said simply. Camilla placed a hand on George's shoulder. The rules exist for a reason, darling. Order, respect, tradition. George looked at her. But you cried. You cried when I bowed the second time? Camilla's composure wavered. She knelt down, eye level with her grandson. Yes, I did. Why? She looked at Thomas, then back at George. Because you taught me something I'd forgotten. That traditions only matter when we understand them. When we feel them, she stood, addressing Thomas now. You reminded us of that too. Thomas's eyes widened. Your Majesty, She raised a hand. You will face consequences that cannot be avoided, but not the ones you expect. George smiled. It was the first real smile he'd shown all day, and somehow Thomas felt lighter. 3 days later, the palace issued a statement. The world waited, expecting an apology or a defense. Instead, they received something no one anticipated. The statement was brief. It announced that the Royal Guard training program would be reformed. Guards would no longer be taught to be invisible. They would be taught to be present, to embody the values they represented, not just the appearance. And Private Thomas Henley would lead the new training initiative. The announcement sent shockwaves through traditional circles. Some called it radical. Others called it long overdue. But the public response was overwhelmingly positive. The video of George and the guard had touched something deep in people, a longing for meaning. For authenticity, Thomas stood in the palace courtyard, wearing his uniform again. But it felt different now. He wasn't invisible. He was seen. And that changed everything. George visited him during his first week in the new role. Charlotte came too, fascinated by the tall hat and shiny buttons. Thomas showed them around the guard station, explaining the history, the duty, the honor behind each tradition. Do you still think I'm just a man? Thomas asked George with a small smile. George tilted his head thoughtfully. Yes, but that's what makes it special. You're a man who chose to stand for something bigger. Thomas's chest tightened with emotion. How could a child understand so much? Charlotte tugged on Thomas's sleeve. Will you teach me to bow properly? She asked. Thomas knelt down. I'll teach you to bow with meaning, Your Highness. That's the only way that matters. Over the following months, the changes became visible. Guards still stood at attention. They still maintained their posts. But when children passed, guards would sometimes kneel briefly, explaining their role at eye level. When tourists asked questions, guards would respond with respect and warmth. The tradition remained. But it was alive now, breathing, human. George's parents, Prince William and Catherine, watched their son with quiet pride. William pulled Camilla aside one evening during a family dinner. What you did, he said carefully, allowing George to question tradition like that, turning it into something positive. That took courage. Camilla smiled sadly. I didn't do anything. George did. He saw what we'd all stopped seeing. She paused, looking across the room where George and Charlotte played. Sometimes children understand royalty better than we do. They haven't forgotten that it's supposed to mean something. William nodded slowly. Perhaps that's why the public responded the way they did. They're tired of empty gestures. They want to believe in something real. The months that followed, something shifted in how people viewed the royal family. The incident at Windsor became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of evolution, of traditions honored through understanding rather than obligation. George returned to his normal life, attending school, playing with his siblings, but he carried something with him now. A lesson he'd learned not from books or tutors, but from a moment of courage, that asking why wasn't disrespectful. It was the most respectful thing you could do. One afternoon, George's class took a field trip to the Tower of London. The yeoman warders, the ceremonial guards there, gave presentations about history and duty. George listened carefully. At the end, his teacher encouraged questions. George raised his hand. Why do you wear that uniform? He asked. The warder smiled. Not the rehearsed smile of someone answering a tourist, but a genuine smile of someone who'd been asked the right question. 'Cause once upon a time, the warder said, someone decided that some things were worth protecting, worth standing for. The uniform reminds me, every day, what those things are. George nodded. Thank you for remembering. The warder's smile widened. Thank you for asking. That evening, the story of George's question made its way through the staff at the tower, then to the press, then to the public. And once again, people were reminded of something simple but profound. Tradition without meaning is just performance. But tradition with understanding becomes legacy. Years passed. George grew older, taller. His face lost some of its childish softness, but his eyes remained serious and thoughtful. The incident at Windsor became part of his story, retold in documentaries and books about the modern monarchy, but for George it wasn't a story. It was a moment that shaped how he saw the world. On his 16th birthday, a private ceremony took place at Windsor Castle. Family gathered along with a few select guests. Among them was Thomas Henley, now a captain in the Royal Guard. His chest decorated with commendations for his work reforming the training program, George stood before his family, dressed formally. A tradition required him to make a speech, to reflect on his journey toward adulthood and eventual duty. He spoke about responsibility, about service, about the weight of symbols and the importance of substance, but then he paused, his eyes finding Thomas in the crowd. When I was young, George said, his voice steady, I asked a question that I wasn't supposed to ask. Why must I bow? A brave man answered me, not with words at first, but with action. He reminded me that traditions are only as strong as the understanding behind them. The room was silent, hanging on every word. I've learned since then that being royal isn't about being above others. It's about standing for values that matter. Justice, compassion, truth. And sometimes, it's about having the courage to ask why, even when it's uncomfortable. George looked at his grandmother, Queen Camilla, now older, but still elegant. She smiled at him, her eyes glistening. The crown will come to me one day, George continued, but I don't want to wear it as a decoration. I want to wear it as a responsibility. To the people, to the country, to the idea that service means something real. Applause filled the room, but it was different from the polite clapping that usually followed royal speeches. This was genuine, moved, inspired. After the ceremony, George found Thomas standing by one of the tall windows, looking out over the grounds where everything had begun. Do you ever regret it? George asked, standing beside him. Thomas considered the question. Breaking protocol? Losing my post? No. He turned to George. You gave me something that day, Your Highness. You gave me back my purpose. George smiled. You gave me mine too. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as Charlotte, now a young teenager herself, ran across the lawn with friends. She'd grown into a confident young woman, unafraid to question, unafraid to challenge. She's like you, Thomas observed. She's better, George replied. She never forgot the lesson. I had to learn it. Thomas chuckled. The best leaders are the ones who remember they had to learn. As the sun set over Windsor, painting the ancient stones in gold and amber, George thought about the future, about the crown that would one day rest on his head, about the traditions he would uphold and the ones he would change. But most of all, he thought about that moment. The moment a small boy refused to bow until he understood why. The moment a guard broke his silence because someone finally saw him. The moment tradition met truth. And he promised himself that when his time came to lead, he would never forget. That evening, before bed, Charlotte knocked on George's door. She sat on the edge of his bed, something clearly on her mind. I remember that day, she said quietly. At Windsor? When you wouldn't bow? George looked at his sister. I didn't think you'd remember. You were so young, Charlotte shook her head. I remember because I was scared. Everyone was scared. But then you did something I didn't understand. She paused. You made it okay to ask questions. George felt a lump in his throat. It should always be okay to ask questions. Charlotte smiled. When I'm older, when I have my own duties, I'm going to remember that. I'm going to ask why. and I'm going to make sure others can too. George pulled his sister into a hug. You're going to be extraordinary, Charlotte. We both will be, she whispered back. As Charlotte left, George turned off his light and lay in the darkness. Through his window, he could see the silhouette of the guard post, where a lone figure stood watch, protecting, serving, standing for something. And George understood, now more than ever, that the greatest traditions weren't the ones that never changed. They were the ones that evolved while keeping their heart intact. The story of the boy who refused to bow became legend, but it was never about refusal. It was about respect, true respect, the kind that asks questions and seeks understanding, the kind that sees the person beneath the uniform and the purpose beneath the crown. And in that small moment, witnessed by thousands but understood by few, the future of a monarchy was quietly transformed, not by rebellion, but by a simple, profound question: why?